All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. We're going to be talking about our first group of plants today. So we have gone over and learned our local members of the Cupressaceae, the juniper family, and the Pinaceae, the pine family, which are key conifers, the main group of gymnosperms here in Colorado. So I'm not going to go over those, but instead I'm going to launch into our first group of angiosperms. Now, I would say one trend to keep in mind as we walk through the groups of angiosperms is a general pattern of increased pollinator specificity over time. However, there are plenty of cases of reversal and convergent evolution. So, in general, we start from kind of primitive states of flowers with many simple parts per whorl, and then the more derived or evolved form would be fewer modified parts per whorl. The ancestral state would have distinctive whorls. And then you start to see fusion. We will see this particularly in the Asteridoeudicots. And that fusion can be between individual parts within a whorl and between distinctive whorls. So we've seen that with the Hypanthium for sure. The ancestral symmetry would be radially symmetrical, like this big magnolia here. And derived feature that's evolved over and over again is bilateral or zygomorphic symmetry of the flower. The ancestral state of the ovary is superior, and repeatedly inferior ovaries have evolved. So that's kind of a trend we're going to play around with, particularly within the eudicots. Okay, but today we are going to be starting within the monocots. And I've divided these plant families up into groups of somewhat shared features to ease your ability to learn them. And so that there's, a somewhat similar number of families and species to learn. Okay. So the group we're learning today are the non-graminoid monocots. Put it another way, all of the monocots, with the exception of the grasses and their closest relatives. And I've chosen specific families again with kind of a couple different criteria. Number one, globally important families. So the Orchidaceae certainly fits into that. And then families that we see often in Colorado during field botany. So I've chosen the Commelinaceae, the Iridaceae, and then this giant mess called the former Liliaceae that we're going to get into today. And just in general, a lot of this stuff I'd say is learn for learning's sake. Yes, there's going to be some beautiful pictures that might help your studying of specimens and plants in the field. But I'm going to give a lot more information than what we're going to be able to cover on field trips and in classes. So I hope it's of interest to lots of you. Okay, so here again is that chunk of the phylogeny that we've looked at before, highlighting the monocots. What is colored in yellow here are the families that we're going to be emphasizing today. But I want to give you kind of a sense of what's outside of that we're not specifically covering. Okay, so monocots are a very large clade of plants, albeit with lots of very important features, which we've talked about, parts in threes, for the most part, parallel leaf venation. We'll talk about exceptions to that in just a second. Fibrous roots, et cetera, et cetera. And here's the phylogeny here with all of the recognized orders written with the ales at the end. The first two evolving lineages, the Acorales and the Elismatales, those are predominantly going to be aquatic and freshwater aquatic in particular. Though one very important group within the Elismatales is the Araceae, or the aroids. Here is a beautiful flower of an Araceae. We saw the Anthurium from the greenhouse in class. Highly reduced down, tiny little unisexual flowers in most cases. So that's an important group. And then we're going to talk about this quote lilioid group. It is not a clade. It is not monophyletic. So it used to be a thing that botanists thought was a lineage. Now we see members showing up all over in the phylogeny. These are going to be very showy, pretty petaloid lineages. And then there's this true clade over here, the commolenids, all right? And that's going to include the poales, which includes the grasses and sedges, as well as my favorite, the pineapple family. We will get to the graminoids, grasses, sedges, and their friends at the very end of class. But today we're going to consider the Commelinaceae, or the spiderwort family, which is a close relative of the grasses and is found here in Colorado. Other really important groups within the commelinids that we're not really covering because they're not in Colorado would be the Ericales, or the palm family. So super important globally, ecologically. We will see it at the Denver Botanical Gardens, as well as the Zingiberales, or the banana and ginger order. So here's a picture up at the top showing some of the relatives found within the Zingiberales. Lots of really important tropical groups here with broad leaves in the understory. So that's kind of a broad brush picture of the monocots. Okay, so how I told you that monocots more or less all have parallel leafination, there are really cool exceptions to that. Net-like venation has actually evolved repeatedly within the monocots, as well as with fleshy fruits. And the two usually, if not always, go hand in hand, particularly in shady understory conditions where light is at a premium and having a broad leaf to intercept all possible light is advantageous. And net-like leaves allow you to kind of fan out all of that blade of the leaf better. Fleshy fruits as well are really important in the understory, especially for recruiting birds and small mammals and other critical seed dispersers. So here is a phylogeny of the monocot written twice, face to face. And on the left, highlighted in the boxes, are all of the origins of net venation. And on the right are all of the origins of fleshy fruits. And you can hopefully see that they always go together. And the boxes are indicating which are the lineages that are in understory clades. So it's a really cool example of a phenomenon in evolutionary biology called concerted convergence, where you see multiple things evolving in tandem together over and over again, usually in response to a very similar ecological pressure all over the world. Okay, so now let's start to unpack this former Liliaceae mess. So the big lilioid group of monocots are the showy, pretty petaloid monocots. The contrast to that will be things like the grasses that we're going to get to, which are beautiful in their own right, but they sure are no lily like you see here, right? So some defining feature that all of these lilioids share together is the leaves lack a petiole. So kind of long, strappy things attached right to the stem. This is a group in which we find our friend the Teeples a lot, right? So we have inner and outer showy, pretty things, and no bracts supplementing that visual display. In strong contrast, in the commelinids, we'll start to see the evolution of bracts taking on some of that showy quality for the floral display. Nectaries. This is a close-up view inside of a tulip, which I know some of you guys saw. And that could be a localized region of the base of the stamens or the ovary that is exuding simple sugars, right? Many lilioids have these, and they are indicative of insect or bird pollination. So very common in this group. There's interesting fruit evolution. We just talked about the repeated evolution of berries, which is a type of fleshy fruit. Other groups have capsules, like the yucca and friends that we looked at in lab. So a three-parted capsule or a berry. Many lilioid monocots have extensive underground structures like bulbs, corms, rhizomes, or tubers that allow them to overwinter and survive fire. So these groups are called geophytes. And if any of you guys have planted tulips or other beautiful spring bulbs, this is exactly what it is. Or an onion, right? You buy an onion, you cut it up, a garlic bulb, etc., etc. That is what you are looking at. So the lilioid monocots are most common and species rich in two global biomes. They're particularly species rich in temperate latitudes in forest understories. These have low light areas where, again, during the summer when the trees above them have leafed out, they kind of try and maximize their leaf area to photosynthesize. And they have those underground structures to allow them to overwinter. Which means that they are part of the beautiful spring bloom globally, which is very nice. They are also particularly species rich in Mediterranean-like ecosystems. So the actual Mediterranean region, California, central Chile, Western Australia, and then the global hotspot of biodiversity of all of these is South Africa, where there are so many of these. Now, many of our spring bulbs that we have bred and traded and planted forever, tulips, hyacinths, things like that, many of them actually originated in Turkey, Iran, kind of Central Asia, and areas like that, where these are very species rich and beautiful. Okay, this group is a systematic mess, and it's actually really hard for me to deal with because I learned it as the Liliaceae. And subsequently, there's been lots of really important studies using molecular systematics or DNA-based phylogenies that have determined that the Liliaceae, as I learned it, is not monophyletic. Okay, so this group that all used to be together, they shared the features, and this is your first time seeing one of these floral formulas. A calyx of 3, a corolla of 3, an androecium, the house of male of G, and a gynoecium of 3 fused carpels, that's what those brackets mean, that is superior. So it used to be all plants that kind of fit this were shoved together into the Liliaceae. However, these features have been determined to be primitive and therefore are not the derived states that we like to use to define groups. So what that means is now DNA evidence has shown that we're grouping a bunch of unrelated taxa that now have been split up into at least 3 different orders. So I'm not going to require you to learn their new names, but you can if you want to be an actual functioning botanist if you want. So here's some photos of some of the native species here in Colorado. So one of the new families that's split out from the Liliaceae is the Ruskaceae. And we have Polygonatum or Solomon seal and Mayanthemum racemosum. Here in the photo, they call it Smilacina. That's the old name. These are lovely understory kind of montane forest species. Then we have the Agavaceae. So that includes certainly our local Yucca, which will have big, beautiful, very lilioid flowers. Many other species of Yucca. Here's Yucca whipplei. So you can see that has a big compound inflorescence. And here's a close-up of that enigmatic tiny little yucca moth, that mutualist with the species. Others that we don't really have in Colorado that are native include the agave group, which is huge throughout the New World desert ecosystems in particular. And then all our favorites, our friend, the Leucocrinum montanum, the sand lily that we see all over near Colorado Springs. Another fun family is the Alliaceae or the alums. If any of you are cooks, you may know that often a base of lots of savory dishes are going to be your onions, your leeks, your garlics, right? That's the family that these are all found in. Again, the bulb part is super critical. We have a number of lovely native species of allium, which certainly have been used by indigenous communities here in Colorado. So here is a close-up of the flowers of Allium textile. They're going to be beautiful little capsular fruits and seeds popping out there. Here's another family, the Melanthiaceae, and two important members here in Colorado. Zygodinus, this is the death camas. This seemingly, innocent little white flowered friend, you'd find it at kind of higher elevations, montane ecosystems, particularly with wet soils, is incredibly toxic. You could absolutely kill a human if you knew what you were doing with the roots. Not so toxic is this absolutely beautiful friend, Veratrum, or the corn lily. In the higher elevation ecosystems, particularly around aspen stands in the Colorado Rockies, there's whole fields of this stuff. It does look like corn, particularly in late summer, and it will have kind of a terminal inflorescence with tiny little white star lily looking flowers, which is quite charming. It's one of my favorites. Okay, moving on to another family, the Iridaceae, or the iris family. Here is a map showing where this family is distributed globally. So you see it's kind of all over. And this has been recognized as a distinctive family for a really long time. So down here, kind of at the base, is all the like mess of Liliaceae, with some of it spread over here. But Iridaceae has kind of always been recognized as distinctive. Again, the majority of global richness in this family is going to be in Mediterranean-like climates, geophytes. Again, South Africa, the Mediterranean proper, thinking France, Spain, Italy, etc., has a lot of species. We have a few here in North America. The leaves are all basal, and there's that very fun word equitant, where you have kind of the overlapping two-dimensional bases of the leaves there. There again is the floral formula. The notice here that the gynoecium is inferior. And iris flowers are really, really interesting. So next time you see one, see if you can note this. It appears there's three showy parts here. Okay, the three things that are standing up are the petals, okay? And they're forming the flag or the standard in the center. Then the lowest thing down are going to be the sepals, or called the falls. And that's where you're going to get a lot of the really beautiful pigmentation, some hairs, things like that, touch guides for insects to go into the interior. Then right above that, oppressed to the sepals, are going to be stamens that are actually petal-like. So if you peel that back, you will see truly a little anther in there, and right under it are going to be the style. Here is actually what's causing all that petal-like. So you pull it and there's a true stamen under there, and the top part is actually the style fanned out with a stigmatic region right under it. So hopefully we'll get to see that together. And yep, you can kind of see the bulge down there, down low. The gynoecium is inferior, and it will mature into a three-parted capsule that splits open at maturity. The fleur-de-lis, which is a symbol of France and New Orleans and all kinds of fun stuff like that, is actually a depiction of the iris. Fun fact. And here is a beautiful photo from iNaturalist of our native Iris missouriensis, the western iris. Here's another local species in the iris family, Sisyrinchium campestre, the blue-eyed grass. So it doesn't have all that fun iris flower stuff, but it definitely has the equitant leaves. Okay, now a favorite of many people, the Orchidaceae. Now in Colorado, it is not particularly species rich, but globally it is huge. It's probably the greatest number of species of any plant family at all. At least 22,000 species have been described, but of course, most of those are in the tropics. Orchids have a very tight and important relationship with fungi. The term for that is mycotrophic. They are dependent upon fungi for the seeds to germinate, to function in their environments. Now, some actually eat and consume fungi, or they get all their nutrients from it. So we actually have some orchids here native to Colorado, like this Corallarhiza striata you see here. Do you notice how there's no green whatsoever? This plant has jettisoned the ability to photosynthesize. Instead, it is reliant upon underground mycorrhizal symbionts, essentially, or actually it's parasitizing the mycorrhizae to gain all of its photosynthate. Now, of course, the fungi is getting that from other photosynthesizers elsewhere in the ecosystem or from decomposing of other things. So definitely look out for really odd colored, kind of sickly pinks, yellows, oranges, rust colored plants in the understory of like spruce fir forests a little higher up, lower elevation too, but understories of forests to find some of these mycotrophic plants. There's microtrophic lineages outside of the orchids as well, but when you see an orchid, it's pretty special. We also have very showy photosynthesizing orchids as well. Now, the orchid families, the majority of them, of course, are found in the tropics and subtropics. They can live anywhere up to incredibly high elevations. They're found in pretty much every single environment. The majority of the species are epiphytes, though, or plants that live on other plants. They are not harming the plants, but they are just colonizing a different ecosystem that kind of jettisons their need to be soil bound. We do not have any epiphytic orchids here in Colorado. Our native species, you're going to find them generally in the understory of forests or in like ephemeral kind of stream sides in the higher elevations. Look particularly like at road cuts in the higher elevation where you get kind of these dripping little mini streams kind of all season long and get these beautiful little microhabitats that support a lot of orchids. That's the best place to find them in Colorado. Okay, so orchids have some of the coolest reproductive biology of any of the plant families. Their most distinctive feature is their lowest most petal, which is modified into a labellum or a lip, which is the key visual, scent, touch location signaling to very specific pollinators as a landing platform. Another weird thing, so in the case of this Ophrys here, the majority of this fuzzy structure you see here is the single third petal, the labellum. There are 3 sepals and 2 other petals that are showy, but not quite as interesting as that one, the labellum there. And of course, that would be the thing that might be mimicking the look, the touch, and the scent of a female wasp or fly's abdomen coercing a male into pollinating it. Another cool thing that the orchids do is they mass all of their pollen together into a clump called a pollinia, as opposed to having dust-like free pollen. So if you ever see an orchid flower, be very careful, but you might be able to see kind of a glob if you know where you're looking. They have a highly reduced stamen number. I'll show you that in a minute. When they produce seeds in a fruit, usually like a long fleshy fruit, sometimes capsular, the seeds are incredibly numerous and very, very tiny. They are about as small as an angiosperm can be. Okay, so here's the floral formula for the Orchidaceae. 3 calyx, not very interesting. A strongly zygomorphic corolla. 2 kind of look like one thing, and then the +1 is the labellum, the really distinctive third petal. The number of stamens can vary, 3, 2, or 1, depending on the lineage. And very critically, those stamen are fused with the gynoecium into a kind of projecting structure called the column. That's kind of hard to understand when you see one. So here, kind of in the center of this figure, is a column itself. On the underside is the sticky stigma. You can often feel it. And then wrapped around and protruding out of that is the filaments with the anther right at the end. And then the pollinia is the mass of pollen coming out of that anther one time. They will produce capsular fruit. Here are some of our natives. So probably about the showiest orchid you could find in Colorado would be the Calypso orchid here, Calypso bulbosa. Look again at that beautiful labellum. And then over here is one species of Platanthera, or ladies' tresses orchids. These are very small white flowers. They have a really distinctive nectar spur, which is a modification of, I'm pretty sure the labellum itself, a pouch where it's producing lots of pollen. And again, this is going to be in very moist, kind of boggy ground at higher elevations. This was taken at 10,000 feet in elevation. Okay, finally then, we move out of the lilioid group, which was here, and do just a quick taste of the leonids. This is a big clade leading to the grasses and friends. So there's kind of a cool overall evolutionary trend in the monocot families here, which is a reduction of the flower, a loss of, that should say nectar, it got cut off, and loss of zoophily or association with animals for pollination, and the expansion and evolution of bracts. So you might find it kind of interesting that wind pollination is a derived or later evolving trait, whereas animal pollination, showy flowers, is kind of more ancestral in this group. And here is our native spiderwort, Tradescantia occidentalis, the prairie spiderwort. It has these really beautiful hairs coming out in addition to the stamens here. And those are actually 1 cell thick. So when you see one, I want you to look with your hand lens and see if you can actually see single cells like pearls on a string hanging off of that. It's got very monocotty, long, strappy leaves and very showy, pretty blue flowers. And that is it for this lecture.